but I'll stand at a distance. So I just want to do a little intro about why we're here, and then I'll pass it off to Nancy, and she'll introduce some of the invasives that we're going to do. So at long last, we're getting to do this invasive species removal workshop, even though COVID made it difficult. Back in April, we had to cancel. So this is funded by a mini grant from the Alabama Invasive Plant Council that all the grant partners work together to initiate. We've got the Creek Line, the Wood Duck Heritage Preserve, ACES Water, and Pepperell Partnership. And I think Tippy with Keep Up Like a Beautiful dropped off some litter pickup supplies so we can pick up litter while we remove invasives. This is a kind of a perfect spot to do this because we have Rocky Brook Creek, which runs through the park. And later on, we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of removing invasives along creeks because they're often a conduit for, taking those seeds and moving them downstream. And those riparian buffers are also really important ecologically for aquatic animals. So we will talk more about that and maybe address some of the kudzu along the creek. We can do something like this again, and part of invasive removal, as I'm sure Nancy will explain more, that is that long-term care aspect where you can't just come out once and think that it's good. You're going to have to come back and do repetitive treatments and maintenance. So hopefully this will just be the beginning of a long-term plan to help improve the heritage preserve. All right. I'll pass this off to Nancy and let you introduce yourself and talk about what we're looking at.
All right. Hey, everybody. Sorry. I'll remove this. So I'm Nancy Lowenstein. So I'm an extension specialist at Auburn. My area is invasive plants. I'm also the executive director of Alabama Invasive Plant Council, so I'm wearing a couple of hats today. So we're here to get rid of invasive plants. And so as Jean said, we've already been tackling this for a couple of years. And as Laura's mentioned, invasive plants removals, there's no silver bullets for getting rid of invasive plants, and it's not something you get done in a weekend. So we're weekend warriors today, but you have to keep at it. So what I was going to do today is just talk about some of the invasives that are out here, and then we were going to briefly go over some different options on ways of tackling them. Let me back up a little bit. Again, so with urban parks, though, are often sinks for invasive plants, partly because a lot of them are along waterways. So as Laura mentioned, seeds come in the water, so you get a lot of seeds that way. And then also we're near all the residential areas that are another source of invasive plants. So urban green spaces just tend to be chock full of invasive plants. But we also want to use these spaces for education. So we want to have the natives here, get rid of the non-natives so we can focus on those. And that being said, there are a lot of invasive plants to see here. One of the main ones that we were going to tackle today is kudzu, which I'm sure everyone here recognizes, right? It's the poster plant of invasive plants in Alabama. Pretty much the only thing you might confuse it with is poison ivy. So small kudzu can look a little bit like a vigorous poison ivy, since they both have trifoliate leaves. Kudzu can be controlled with foliar herbicide sprays, but of course a lot of times kudzu is crawling way up into the tops of trees and it's covering huge areas. So for, when you're just tackling something on a small scale, foliar is not going to be an option a lot of the times. What you can do in these cases would be to pull down as much kudzu as you can and find the root crown and either do a cut stump treatment on that root crown, so treat it with glyphosate, or you can actually do what we call the kudzu chop, and is cut underneath that root crown, and you'll essentially kill that little portion of the kudzu plant. Of course, kudzu roots it can root at every single node as it's trailing along the ground, so you can get a gazillion root crowns in a large space. So that's not, you could be out there forever just treating root crowns. So really the root crown approach is, if you have a small infestation or say you've done a broadcast spray with herbicides, you can come back later because they're going to regrow. After you've killed a lot of the vegetation that's there, you can find those root crowns and treat them individually for the one, the persistent ones that you're not getting with the herbicides. And in this kind of situation, we're kind of restricted to using glyphosate or triclopyr. There are some other herbicides that work more efficiently on kudzu, but not really an option in this kind of setting. And there are several extension pubs on kudzu control. All right. The other main one that's out here is Chinese privet, another one that, anyone that's lived in Alabama for any length of time knows privet. I will say, so I also teach dendrology, which is tree ID, and I'm always surprised students get this wrong quite a lot, actually. I think partly because, I've got 3 different samples here, and they all kind of look a good bit different. So privet can have these almost, just a whip, if you will, and you can clearly see the opposite leaves, and the leaves are oval with an entire margin. But then you get these, where you have these short little branches, and these can sometimes look like compound leaves, and I think that's what confuses students. It's like, ooh, is that a black locust? No. But that does happen sometimes, especially when you get these short little branches. You can also get a lot of these short little branches if you have heavy deer browse, because deer will eat privet a lot. All right, so here's the seeds, or the fruit of privet. Right now, they're still green. These will turn dark blue, purplish black when they're ripe. Besides Chinese privet, we also have Japanese privet and glossy privet. Glossy and Japanese privet have larger leaves, but they're both starting to escape and become invasive. Okay, another one we were going to tackle is thorny olive. Right here, though, I have a autumn olive. So Elaeagnus umbellata. Then there's Elaeagnus pungens. The way you tell them apart is autumn olive on the underside has just silver scales. Thorny olive has silver and brown scales. Thorny olive also has, its growth form is different. It tends to have these whips that gets really long, and they can actually twine up into foliage that's growing overhead. And as the name implies, they have spur shoots that are very, very sharp, essentially thorns. Personally, I'd rather deal with controlling privet all day than mess with thorny olive, because those thorns, they hurt. They can actually, you can get infections pretty easily if you get impaled with them. Autumn olive's not so bad, because it may occasionally have those kind of whips, but typically does not have any thorns. All right, another one I saw a little bit of out here just on the forest edge. I'm not sure how much is around, but this is one that you find quite a bit in riparian areas, is Japanese stiltgrass. So is there much of this out here? So Japanese stiltgrass is a little annual grass. Shouldn't say it's little. It can get up usually about knee height, sometimes waist height. And the name comes from the stiltgrass is, so see, it gets these little aerial roots that form at the nodes, and they kind of look like stilts. So this one, if you have a small area of it, this pulls out of the ground really, really easily. So like most grasses are super hard to pull, and anyone who's a gardener knows that I hate weeding grasses. But this, just a small yank, pulls it out. And it's actually one way to, there are a couple lookalikes, and one way to verify that you have stiltgrass is that it comes out of the ground so easily. This is just now getting ready to bloom. So, and it does produce a lot of seeds, and the seed bank lasts for a good long while. So if you can get rid of it before it goes to seed, it's a good thing. So this can, like I said, small amounts can be pulled, and you can use a very light solution of glyphosate to control it. But the thing is that, it's growing on the ground, so you might have a lot of other things in there that you don't want to kill. So you could have collateral damage there. One other thing about this is, even though these flowers are just now expanding, it also has interior flowers that are self-pollinated, if you will. So they're cleistogamous flowers. So even though it's going to produce seeds inside that you may, you may not see them. All right, just a couple others. This is another little edge plant, early successional species, a garden weed, chamber bitter, or gripeweed. A lot of people like to call it. It's in the Euphorbiaceae family, and it's got the fruit are actually on the back side of these little branchlets that look like compound leaves. And these things, when they are ripe, they explode and send the seeds flying every which way. So once you get a population of this, you'll be dealing with it for a long time. It's really difficult to control. It doesn't deal well with shade very much, so we don't, it's not one that's likely to become a problem in the woods. Here's another one we were supposed to talk about, Nandina, sacred bamboo. So, excuse me. This one's easily recognized with these huge bipinnately compound leaves, and then these berries that are going to turn bright, bright, bright red in the fall. So this is still used a lot as an ornamental. A lot of the cultivars that they're using now, though, are supposed to be sterile. But the old-fashioned ones that are still around old home sites and stuff spread a lot. And we're starting to see a lot more of this in the woods. There's also, here we have a lot of the Vinca major, common Vinca. There's tons of it along the edge here. So evergreen vine. This one doesn't spread too much by seed, but once it's established, it's kind of hard to get rid of. It has really waxy leaves, so it's probably going to be hard to, get herbicide absorbed in it without a really good surfactant. Another vine we have a lot of all over Alabama is Japanese honeysuckle. This is another one I'm surprised that my students mis-ID this a lot. Probably because it does like the privet, and sometimes instead of just being a long vine like you expect, it will get short little branches that don't really look like a vine, and it's confusing. Another thing that honeysuckle will do is sometimes the new leaves will be lobed. So that's kind of, not expected. But so we see we've got both of those leaf forms on the same branch. But one thing to look for to confirm that you have honeysuckle is that the stems are really fuzzy. And this is just kind of cool. If you break a stem, it's hollow. I have a little bit of English ivy out here. All right, the only other one I was going to mention, and then I'll stop talking, is this is perilla mint that we're starting to see more of around. Also typically on edges or in pastures where it is a significant problem. It's also called shiso, and it's actually used in cooking. And even though it's used in cooking for people, it's deadly toxic to livestock. So when it gets in pastures, it's bad news. If you smell the leaves, it smells like a black jelly bean, that licorice smell. So it's in the mint family, pretty distinctive, especially now when it's got the flowers on it. Kind of got these purple stems, this wavy leaf, and that smell. But anyway, a lot of times the plants that we see growing on the edges of trails, and we think, it's not so bad, it's just on the edge of trails. That's where it starts. And then it can move in. And so it's hard to predict which species might adapt to handle being in the woods more. So the reason we want to remove invasive plants is that most of them grow so aggressively that they're taking over the native plants that would be there. So like if we look out over here, all we see pretty much is Chinese privet and kudzu and a few trees that are still up in the canopy. None of those trees are able to produce saplings to replace themselves. So once that overstory dies out, there's not an understory. Pretty soon the forest will be gone in the long term. And also, so another reason is that, I don't know about y'all, but I don't think that looks good. So just from aesthetics, and Alabama has some of the highest biodiversity in this country. We have the highest oak diversity in the country. And this is what we're looking at instead. Another thing, is not only the plants that are displaced, but a lot of native, the insects and birds and everything that depend on the native plants. So but on the other hand, it's like, I'm sure Eve will talk about, you can't just go in and clear the edge of a slope by a creek and walk away, because they are holding, that is one thing they are doing, is holding the soil in place. So you can't just go do that and expect everything to say, hey, we got rid of the invasive plants, everything's fine. So they've done damage. We have to do some restoration and not just go in there and get rid of them.
I just wanted to say, I think I forgot to mention this earlier. I mean, not only are we thinking about invasive removal here, but a lot of these plants, like Nancy mentioned, like the English ivy, these are plants that are still sold in big box stores or at nurseries. And the nandina, I mean, these are a lot of types of plants that people purchase and then take home into their home landscape and plant. Even privet, people plant that as a hedgerow. So part of our goal is to just elevate that awareness that these are invasive plants, even though they're sold in stores, that if we can just make people aware that bringing them home and planting them, they don't just stay in your yard, they get dispersed, and they can be really harmful to native ecological landscapes. So that's one thing we want to really get across. Well, okay, so for next steps, I'm thinking, this is what I'm imagining will work well, that we just kind of move together and we'll take maybe one of each tool, and we'll just walk around this area, and we can demonstrate how to remove, and then we'll come back up and disperse.